Hello, you're listening to Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkl SEND. As a former teacher in Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by Joe Fautley. Joe is an autistic and neurodivergent advocate who also has dyspraxia and anxiety. Joe currently works full-time at the Council for Disabled Children, part of the National Children's Bureau. Outside of his day job, Joe is a member of the Global Equality Collective Circle of Influence and has over 10 years' experience in a variety of advocacy and professional training work for autism, neurodiversity, and special educational needs and disabilities. Joe regularly contributes to various media, providing practical advice for professionals who support autistic children and young people using insights from his own personal lived experience. He has also delivered many presentations to various audiences. You might have seen him. He's been featured on a video published by the NHS that has received over 9,000 views on YouTube, and previously co-delivered national SEND training to hundreds of professionals across England. Joe is passionate about using his voice and lived experience to be a real positive role model and help inspire and support others. For example, he uses his platform on LinkedIn, which I follow, and it's brilliant, and it has over 1,800 followers, and he shares his personal experiences to help spread awareness, acceptance, and understanding of autism and neurodiversity across the wider SEND and SEND community. And Joe's experiences as an autism advocate shape his approach to making education more accessible and comfortable for students with autism. He plays a vital role as co-chair of the NCB Staff Disability and Neurodiversity Network, empowering colleagues who are disabled and or neurodivergent. Wow, Joe, that's impressive, isn't it? Lovely to meet you.
Thank you very much. It's really great to meet you, Georgina.
Thank you. So first of all, tell us about yourself and your role at the National Children's Bureau.
Yes, thank you. I'm really passionate about being an advocate for autistic people and people who are neurodivergent as well. So my current day job is I work full time based at the Council for Disabled Children
Yep.
at the National Children's Bureau. So it's a children's charity based in Hackney in London. But usually I have a flexible working, so I would normally go to work in the office normally about once or twice a week usually,
Yep.
and then the other days at home. And yeah, it's a really I'm really lucky to be working there. It's a really interesting role, where I help to support various events
Yeah.
that my team does for delivering workshops to professionals across England,
Amazing.
which is really interesting. And it's a really supportive team to work for as well. And I've been really lucky and really grateful as well that my team have been really supportive and really patient and understanding with me as well.
Yeah. No, it sounds brilliant. It really does. It sounds like doing some really important work. If we talk about sort of your autism diagnosis, because I know that you're very keen to talk about that, which is great. And I think it's going to be so important for our listeners to, hear from you and actually hear from someone who's autistic and learn how to support children who are autistic in the classroom. So you were diagnosed as autistic when you were 7, I believe. What was it that led your family or your school to think you were autistic? What were they thinking?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed formally at the age of 7, but there was quite a lot of different experiences before that led my family and also professionals as well to lead up to that diagnosis. Originally I was born prematurely, at 11 weeks prematurely.
Oh, wow.
So that sort of started really from straight away from when I was born, really, different health needs.
Yeah.
So I did have global development delay when I was young, and so that affected quite a lot of various developmental in my childhood. For example, with my speech,
Yeah.
and that's something that's still continued throughout my life. Whereas I still have different delays with my speech and language skills,
Yeah,
but especially from when I was young and during my childhood as well. Um, so that really sort of led on to when I first started at a specialist school, which one of the first school I attended was a specialist school, and that was a really positive experience for me. Because it was specialist speech and language and communication skills,
yeah,
so that really helped me to be able to have the right support when I was younger. Because definitely I wouldn't have been able to cope with mainstream school at
yeah,
that time, especially. So then that led on eventually to I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum then a little bit later on.
yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah, and it's like you said, it sounds like the right setting for you at the time as well, the school that you were at. What was, because we always hear about like the diagnosis process from like teachers and from like professionals. What's it like? Can you remember the actual diagnosis process? How thinking you were 7, so you're quite young to be able to remember it. But what's your memory, I suppose, or your experience of being diagnosed and the diagnosis process? What do you remember about it?
Yeah, so because I was only quite young, but
Yeah.
a lot of the experiences were based on what my parents have shared
Yeah, that
with us,
makes sense.
really. But yeah, it was quite a long process. I think it took about 18 months, I think,
Wow.
in total to go through. I know that even today the
Yeah.
diagnosis process is extremely long, but even it was back in those days as
That's
well.
interesting to know because we do complain understandably about how long it takes now to get a diagnosis. And I know some places it can be like 3 to 5 years and probably even
Oh
more for some
yes,
places.
yeah.
But that's interesting. You still had to wait a significant amount of time then.
Yeah, because even going back into that time, it's still very significantly long.
Yeah.
But it did involve quite a different professional. So
Yeah.
speech and language therapist, but also a clinical psychologist as well.
Yeah.
And I think yeah, as far as what sort of has been talked about really with family, that the diagnosis process was positive, even
Yeah.
though it was extremely frustrating, I think, definitely for my family because they wanted to have the answers and they wanted to be able to feel more confident that I would get the right support that I needed.
Yeah.
And so it was quite stressful, I think, and quite frustrating for my family going through that process. But
Yeah.
then once I did receive the diagnosis, it was much more positive overall from them because it enabled me to help get the extra support that I needed from the specialist school at the time, but also helping with different sort of different areas of life as well, following on from that.
Yeah. And I suppose like understanding yourself a little bit better and your parents understand, other people understand you a little bit better must be helpful. What was your experience in school then? Was it positive? Were the things you found difficult? What was it? You've said reasonably positive experience of school.
Yeah, so it was quite a variety of different experiences. I would say definitely from the specialist school it was positive,
Yeah.
definitely. But it was sort of not too long after my diagnosis, a little like a few months later or so, I did eventually move into mainstream primary
Oh,
for the first time, which eventually turned out to be extremely detrimental to my
oh gosh. Okay.
well-being, really unfortunately. But it was agreed at the time that they felt well that it would be sort of the right decision at the time because I was achieving well with my academics or abilities at the time, and they felt that it would be good to go to a mainstream environment. However, yeah, that extremely affected my well-being once I was in the mainstream. Because primarily I am regarding my anxiety as well went completely higher during that time, and because I wasn't receiving the right support and the understanding from the majority of staff there at school.
You've
So that was
experienced that. Yeah,
extreme.
that's horrible.
Yeah, it was extremely frustrating and lots of different sort of situations going through. So I was at that primary school for about 3 years. So it wasn't the complete primary school because I did have to eventually move to another school for about the last 2 years of primary.
Yeah.
Um, that was actually another mainstream, but actually I was quite lucky with that one
That was
because
better.
that was so much better with
Yeah.
having the right right understanding and the right support as well.
Gosh, that's so I'm just
Um,
thinking, like, for teachers listening, he can hear you saying that. It's so it just goes to show how important support is, and getting the support in the right place and the understanding is. If you've been to two separate mainstream primary schools, and the impact of them just being much better at supporting and much better at understanding, and that impact it has on your whole entire life. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because there was so much difference between those two schools at primary level. Also, and it made yeah, they were just completely different from each other. And like the first primary school really led to me being non-verbal
Oh gosh, yeah.
for quite a significant amount of time. Because it just my mental health got extremely severe, and yeah, it was extremely affecting my well-being. And
Yeah.
yeah, for quite a large majority of that time, I wasn't able to communicate verbally.
Gosh.
So then that led to with my family becoming even more
Oh,
stressed,
yeah, I can
frustrated as
imagine.
well, because they were trying to find like the right ways of helping me to communicate as well, and eventually things did get gradually better once I moved away from that school,
Yeah.
and once I got a little bit older, that things did change a bit, but it was yeah still quite a lot of time.
Yeah, gosh, that sounds really difficult. It really does. What what was it that they did in the what did they do in the second primary school that was better than the first then? If there's was there anything you can put your finger on that was like that was good and that was how they supported me better?
Yeah, I think just just overall, I think the way that the culture was at the school and
Yeah,
sort of the general way of working, like to have support for children there who had disabilities, I think was definitely much more inclusive, and
yeah,
I felt there was a lot more resources, and I think the staff had like generally a much better understanding, and they were able to be more flexible with me as well. Because I remember from the first primary school that the staff just didn't have the right knowledge and
yeah.
understanding. No, no,
Gosh,
no, there wasn't enough flexibility as well,
yeah,
and because of my anxiety, that was often underestimated as well. So a lot of professionals there that didn't take my anxiety seriously at all during the first school.
yeah. Oh, that's really hard. I can understand, and I think it's brilliant that you've become like an advocate and you're championing for children who are autistic and neurodivergent in general, and just saying like, these are the things you can do in schools, and you're trying to upskill teachers. I think it's brilliant what you're doing. I really, really do. Um, so can you tell us a little bit more about sensory processing? Because I know that can be a significant part for some autistic children, and sort of what it is and what schools can do to support children and young people with sensory processing differences.
Yeah, so definitely that's really important, especially from my own experiences,
Yeah.
because it is really important to be able to acknowledge first of all that the school environment is not designed for autistic people.
It's not, you're completely right. I completely agree. It's something, yeah, that I feel passionate about as
Yeah.
well. And especially for sensory, they are like a very sensory overwhelming environment. They're not set up for children with sensory processing differences at all, are they?
No, yeah, definitely, I agree with you. Definitely, it's not designed at all for having that understanding of different sensory needs, and because it's really important to sort of focus on the individual,
Yeah.
because every child has their own sensory profile, their own different challenges regarding sensory needs that can trigger a lot more in that way as well. So really important to firstly understand what's really important for the individual child. Because for me personally, it was a loud noise, and especially that was quite triggering and still is quite triggering today, and in different sort of situations I going through as an adult as well. So yeah, especially as a child, it definitely really helps to have that separate spaces that were available for having that quiet time as well,
Yeah.
because being in the main environment with so much and so much noise from different areas of the environment, but also quite a lot of background sounds as well,
I think people forget
and
the background sounds, don't they? Like the hum of the projector, or there's a plug in our house that annoys
yeah.
hear the electric in it, and it's like a zzz noise, and it's things like that, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah, there is quite a lot of different things to consider in that way. But yeah, I think from my experience, definitely sort of having that flexibility of the child being able to leave a particular environment when it gets too much. But also recognizing that sort of depending on the child's speech and language skills, it might not always be possible. For the child to be able to communicate verbally. And that was especially that resonates with me, especially personally as well, from being non-verbal for quite a few years, and even still today, still having quite a lot of times when my speech doesn't always flow in the right way that I want it to, and I still, and my speech is not always fluent some of the time.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so being able to have different strategies in place, so maybe thinking about more visual strategies and different sort of ways of using pictures and like different coloured like symbols. I know there's a few different strategies around, but sort of thinking in that way, I think definitely really helps. And yeah,
That's
yeah,
a really
definitely.
good point as well about thinking that a child could also be non-verbal. So I think we often we're guilty of thinking, right, okay, with sensory processing differences, what are the strategies that help a child with that? But then we don't think, but also what happens if, as well as that, they are non-verbal? How are you going to support both at the same time? I think that's really, really important because it must be very difficult if you, well, incredibly difficult if you're non-verbal to be able to communicate your needs, especially if you're in distress because of sensory overload. It must be really challenging because you've got two barriers there, haven't you?
Yeah, especially they're definitely really challenging because it's creating the extra barriers in that way as well.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And like we said, some autistic children need support with communication. Is there any way that schools, as well as visuals, can make schools more communication more accessible? How can they, what can they be doing to improve that? Or would you say it's visuals mainly?
Some of that can be visuals, but also using different ways of because there is quite a big variety of different communication methods, and it's really I think sometimes really it all depends on the individual needs, but also trying different methods and seeing what works best for the child, because some methods won't be the best, but then there will be other ways that will work much better as well in different situations.
That's super important, isn't it? Really thinking about the child. And I keep noticing you mentioned individuals, and that is really, really important because you're right, not no two people are the same, and it's really important to think about that and think about how each person actually needs support and what ways you can support them. Did you have any communication support? Did they support you when you were non-verbal?
So I think as far as I can remember, there was some support with using using more visual symbols. I think as far as I can remember,
Yeah,
but it was quite challenging because yeah, the level of support varied quite a lot. So yeah, especially going through the mainstream primary where I had quite a lot of challenges. There wasn't really any support much in place, and yeah, it just got quite a lot worse really.
that's awful. It really is. Um, in the SEN magazine, in SEN magazine, you wrote a brilliant article. I read it. It was fantastic. You wrote openly about the importance of not underestimating anxiety, and I know you've mentioned that as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences of anxiety? And importantly, you said like teachers weren't great at supporting it. What can teachers do to support children who may also, I suppose, autistic children or any child who's got anxiety?
Yeah, thank you. So it's yeah, they're definitely. I've been really lucky to be able to have the opportunities where I can write in the articles, and hopefully it can really help to help really put more focus, especially on anxiety,
Yeah,
because that's something that has been always extremely powerful emotion throughout my childhood.
yeah,
But also today, like during my adulthood as well, it's still having anxiety is still something that always is there in the background, and even though there's sometimes when I'm able to manage it better than others, and different situations that can trigger it a lot more, like being in crowded environments and having a lot of background noise as well, for example. But anxiety is something on a daily basis that impacts on my everyday life.
yeah,
But generally, autistic people and children are more likely to experience high levels of anxiety due to navigating a world that's extremely complicated, and it's having the sensory and the social environment is extremely complicated as well. So I think for me, different times of extreme anxiety, that's often led to what I call zoning out. So which is like a coping mechanism, sort of my own way of being able to manage anxiety when I seem to block out what's happening around me.
Yeah.
And that can be quite difficult and quite sort of like a more high risk depending on what environment I'm in, really. And that's something that I noticed like during my school days as well, happens quite a lot. But one way I think definitely was having a timeout card, for example. That did help me for some of my schooling when I was having better support.
Yeah.
Having that sort of way of and this is something that's more discreet, so it's not immediately obvious to everyone.
Yeah, because that's not going to
Um,
help with the anxiety either, is it? The worry of having to tell people in front of loads of people that you need some time out.
Yeah, definitely, because that creates even more anxiety when
Yeah,
it becomes like quite, and it can be quite intimidating, and it can be embarrassing for
of course,
the
yeah.
individual child as well, sort of knowing that their peers as well are going to know that they need some time out, and they could be like there could be different like bullying involved as well,
Yeah.
potentially.
Gosh, it's awful, isn't it? That you think some people, some teachers could be giving, trying to do the best, giving these children like a timeout card because of anxiety, and could be creating more anxiety because of the timeout card in some ways, couldn't it? Because children could be feeling really worried about using their timeout card, and it creates, yeah, something that was supposed to help could also cause some problems, couldn't it? If not done correctly.
Yeah. Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, so it's really important to recognise sort of different sort of flexibility in that way, really. But that was one way that did help me quite a lot, and just having that time out of the space when my anxiety gets too much.
Yeah,
But also having those regular check-ins as well, because sometimes there can be situations where when I might not always realise like exactly when my anxiety is going to reach like quite the intense levels as well. So to having that space where people can be supportive and checking in to see sort of when that happens really.
that's a
Um,
point.
yeah.
I was just thinking that's brilliant advice because you're right. How to expect like a very young child as well to be able to understand what understand their emotions fully enough to know when it's getting too much for them is a lot to expect of anyone, really, isn't it? So yeah, I think check-ins are a really important strategy, especially with somebody that's trusted. I imagine that's a key part is that the person that you're checking in with is like a trusted adult, somebody that you feel you can confide in, not just some random teacher that's been assigned to you.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely having that good network of support in the school environment where the child or young person can feel confident in being able to trust that person, and that definitely makes a big difference.
Yeah, no, brilliant. That's really good. Um, yeah, so what would be sort of my last question? What would be your biggest piece of advice to teachers listening about supporting autistic children and young people in their school? If there's one main thing you want them to take away from this, what's your big piece of advice?
Yeah, so there's lots of different really important advice, like sort of based on what I've like my own lived experience and what I've written in different media recently as well. But I suppose yeah, well, one piece of advice I would definitely say is being able to give time to process information. Because that's something from my own experience. There were some professionals during my school environment who unfortunately didn't give me the right time and the flexibility what I needed really to be able to process language.
Yeah,
Because it's really important to know that autistic people have lots of difficulties with being able to interpret both verbal and non-verbal language as well.
yeah.
So that can include things like gestures and tone of voice.
Hmm.
And because we also have difficulty reading other people, so like recognizing or being able to understand other people's emotions as well, and to be able to express our own emotions, which is really difficult. So yeah, that's something that is really important throughout childhood and also going into adulthood, still really important as well.
Advice. Yeah, thank you. Honestly, that's been so useful. I think one of our most useful podcast episodes. I'm sure the listeners are going to feel the same as well, because like I said, it's so powerful hearing it from yourself, from an advocate, from somebody who understands it properly, not someone who's an expert. You're an expert because you've got lived experience and you do all this brilliant work. And it's just absolutely wonderful to hear your perspective and understand what it's like from your perspective of when you were an autistic child. It's brilliant. So thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed speaking on the podcast today. Thank you.